Good day. My name is Jason Casada of Nlight Software. Welcome and thank you for attending today's webinar entitled 5 Steps to Data Center Optimization for High Tech. We will be talking about how leading high-tech companies are leveraging data center service management software to improve data center and data room performance. And if you have any questions, please submit them via the chat box on your screen, and we will answer them during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Please note that the webinar will be recorded and be made available to you within 72 hours. All right, so let's get this show on the road. I'd like to now introduce to you Mark Gatos, CMO of Nlight Software. Take it away, Mark.
Thank you, Jason. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I wanted to thank you all for attending the webinar today. We have a pretty full webinar. We also have a pretty full agenda. And typically at Nlight, we try and keep these webinars fast-paced because we've all attended boring webinars. We try not to do that here. So we keep our webinars less than 30 minutes. So they tend to be quick, fast-paced. You can always go review them or just send us questions. As Jason said, we have Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to submit them and we will try to get to them at the end. So today's agenda, real quick, we'll do a quick introduction to Nlight if you're not familiar with us. We'll talk about data center service management, the value proposition of data center service management, because that's a lot about this webinar is about. And then we'll talk about specific challenges in high tech, right? If you're managing data centers in high tech, there's some unique subtleties that are different for high tech organizations. In many ways, data centers are often very similar across industries. We'll talk about that, but there are some unique challenges in high tech. We'll talk about the 5 steps to optimization, specifically in high tech, and then we'll go through 2 real brief case studies, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So without further ado, let's sort of jump into it. So first, a quick introduction to Nlight. Nlight is the leading provider of data center service management software. So we'll talk about this in a second. We were the first company to introduce what is called DCIM, DCIM. If you folks may know, Data Center Infrastructure Management. But we've taken that solution and we've made it larger, and it's about data center service management. We'll get into that in the slides. We've been in business a little over a dozen years, and we've accumulated, fortunately, we provide a great solution, great value, and we have literally hundreds of customers who use us. And this is obviously just a partial list of companies who use us. You can see they vary across a wide range of industries, from consumer to federal agencies use us, financial services, high tech as we're talking today. But what all these companies have in common is they use Nlight. They use Nlight to help manage, automate, and really optimize their data centers and the performance of their data centers in delivering the service to the business. So that's sort of a quick introduction to Nlight. Let's talk about the challenge, really the challenge that data center service management is applied to. And again, we'll get to DCIM in this presentation also. So if you think about the modern data center, you've got a lot of different sort of elements, components, processes you have to manage that are really in between your BMS systems and environmental systems and your ITSM and financial virtualization and ops systems. In the middle are sort of all these things you have to manage. Assets, the resources used by those assets, you've got policies, you've got networking, you've got requirements from the business, you've got people and processes, and you've got all this going on. This is really what data center service management is designed to manage, is the holistic, everything going on inside the data center. And as I mentioned before, DCIM, right, Data Center Infrastructure Management, is the foundation of data center service management. So you start with managing your infrastructure, but then you grow into eventually you want to start managing workflow and the processes and the policies being implemented within the data center or across many data centers or data center rooms. So you're taking into consideration the infrastructure, then you're starting to incorporate people and processes, and then lastly, you want to tie this all into other systems like ITSM, like financial systems, to provide more value to anyone who's dependent on the data center, anybody who needs information that's current from the data center. So this is really the role of data center service management, of DCSM, is to provide the complete suite of modules and functionality that will allow you to seamlessly manage everything that's going on inside the data center and communicate to all the systems that are dependent on it. So there are a myriad of different types of questions that DCSM helps answer, right? And some of them are very operational, right? Where do we place the next 5 racks, right? Do we have physical capacity for a new application? I'm not going to go through all these questions, but you can begin to answer higher end questions, right? Does a particular application have redundancy from a networking perspective, from a power perspective? When are particular servers going to arrive? When are they going to go into service? Who's going to put them into service? What are the risks of an upcoming maintenance plan that you're planning to roll out? You have a maintenance project coming up. What are the real risks that are involved? What systems are going to be touched? DCSM not only is there to help you manage the business operationally more effective, but you begin to answer what-if questions about migrations, consolidations, of risks that perhaps exist, that only in having a holistic solution can you begin to answer those questions with real current data of what's actually happening inside the data center. And as I mentioned before, you want to be able to feed that information up into your change management systems and your CMDBs, into financial systems. So DCSM not only answers, as I said, a lot of operational questions. Where does this go? How do we power it up? How do we network it? And so forth. But it also begins to answer some of the what ifs and help you get ahead of issues you may have in the future. And so a picture is worth 1,000 words. When we talk about this, people are like, well, what do you mean? It's a little too abstract. And so we put this slide in to just give just a sample of some of the functionality, some of the screenshots inside the solution. Obviously, this is not a demo. If you ever want a demo, Nlyte does many demos for a lot of companies to give them a flat feel for how the product works and what you can do with it. But this gives you an idea of some of the types of functionality, the floor planner, the rack view, the 3D rack inventory. We have a module for planning resources, for capacity planning, for managing power, and we just recently acquired FieldView Solutions, and so our ability to manage power has been improved and bolstered enormously. Our next webinar is going to be talking specifically about that one area, and in the middle here you can see workflow management. So again, just to give you a flavor for the solution, these screenshots sort of give you an idea of the types of things we're talking about and the types of things we manage. And one of the strengths of Nlyte is we support the entire life cycle, right? The entire data center life cycle, what we call dock to decom, right? From when assets come on the back dock throughout their entire life cycle and all of the elements going on from tech refresh to dealing with migrations and consolidations to the ultimate decommission. There are many solutions out there. There are a variety of companies that are DCIM providers that manage parts of the infrastructure, ranging from they manage fans to they just provide cabling management. We provide the entire solution to allow you to manage the entire service that is the data center. And that includes, as I mentioned before, managing infrastructure, but also managing workflow and tying that into other systems. So we support, as I said, the entire data center life cycle from dock to decom. And so now let's sort of get into sort of high tech. There are specific challenges you find. We observe as we've talked to, we have many companies who use us who are in the high tech vertical, and we talk to even more. And so there's specific challenges we find. First off, they tend to be very dynamic environments, right? Tend to be very fast paced. They typically are introducing new technologies. And actually the last time I was in IT, I was actually part of I was with a high-tech firm the last time I was in the IT side. I worked for Oracle Corporation back when their data center was in the 400 building back in Redwood Shores. And so I'm very familiar with this. I think at that time at Oracle we were supporting 90 different platforms. And this will certainly age me and show how old I am, because we were supporting platforms like Sequent and Pyramid and Data General, for goodness sake. So Typically, this hasn't changed. High-tech firms typically have a lot of different platforms they're supporting, and it tends to be a very dynamic, fast-paced environment. Second thing, they tend to have very lean teams, and that's probably consistent across a lot of verticals, but I think in high-tech it's very appropriate. Tend to be very small teams. They always create their own tools. It's high-tech after all, so usually they've assembled some solution of their own, a homegrown solution they've hacked out. They may have used some open source technology. They may be using spreadsheets with XML. Who knows? Whenever we go into a high-tech company, they have lean teams that have really cobbled together tools that aren't necessarily always working for them, but what they've put together to try and automate this as best they can. And third, in a high-tech organization, dev and test are critical. You find that dev and test are pulling a lot of resources. The development and test teams are always refreshing those resources. They want the most current assets, and so they tend to have a lot of resources. But we find, sort of interestingly enough, and this never seems to change, there's always a friction with the financial department. CFOs always, where are these resources going? What's happening? And so we find there's always that friction between finance and the dev and test group because they just need resources, and the CFO is always wondering, where did these resources go? And lastly, with high tech, you find you often have very distributed environments. You have distributed dev teams. Either you're getting resources wherever you can find them, whether that's Israel or India or France. You get dev teams in many different locations, or you've acquired different companies, right? High tech tends to acquire quite a few technology companies. And so as a result, you end up with data centers that are very distributed. You end up with many data rooms. And so, again, you end up with a very distributed environment. So again, this is very common in the high-tech environments, right? And so as you begin to look at your data center and say, how are we going to get to data center service management, right? What are the steps you want to take? What are sort of the 5 basic steps? And I realize on this image there are more than 5 steps, but I couldn't find an image with 5 steps. So, but I'm going to take you through sort of the 5 steps, things that we've learned from being in business over a dozen years and having worked with a variety of leading high-tech companies in the world, what we think are sort of the basics. If you are going to start optimizing your data center, if you're going to start moving to managing the data center as a service holistically, these are sort of steps you want to take. So number 1, pick a proven vendor. This is the old garbage in, garbage out. If you start with a bad vendor, you start with the wrong vendor, you're just going to be in a world of pain. And fortunately, Nlyte, we have a 99% customer retention rate. We do not have shelfware. We cannot identify a case where we sold Nlyte and it did not get deployed. So again, look for a proven vendor. Make sure their goals line up with your goals. What is success for them? Is their success selling you more hardware and they'll just throw in some software so that they can lock you in more? Or are they tied to the success of your project? Do they have customers like you? Ask them. Ask them for references. For customers just like you, ask to talk to those customers. See the product in action. I know this seems like a no-brainer, but see the product in action in your environment with your data. I know this will sound incredible, but just recently we had a proof of concept and a vendor left the site, right, of the proof of concept, a competing vendor, because they were unable to put the data of this particular company into their system, and they had to go off-site and have it put in. Just bad news, right? So have them show it to you on-site with your data. Do they give you a roadmap to optimization, right? Do they take you from the beginning but map out, hey, here's how you're going to get optimized. Here's how you're going to tie into other systems. Here's how you're going to really automate the entire service within the data center. And lastly, leverage the analysts, right? A lot of information out there. Gartner has the Magic Quadrant. Gartner has the critical capabilities, which evaluates more of the specific products. And that actual report is supposed to be updated within the next 30 to 45 days. The next version of that report is going to be coming out for the Gartner DSIM Critical Capabilities Report, and IDC has a MarketScape. So there's a lot of information out there, but the key is pick the right vendor, right? Do your research, take your time on the front end, and it will save you a lot of pain in the back end. Second, this relates to picking the right vendor, but consider architecture. You may think I'm making this up, but architecture is very widely out there. And so look for a modern architecture. There are still vendors out there doing client-server. I know that sounds incredible, but there are still client-server architectures out there. Make sure you do your due diligence. Make sure the company is certified by an application security company like a Veracode. Make sure that they have hardened their solution and that security is a concern, right, for the organization, right? Make sure the vendor is concerned with security and that they've taken the time to get certified by an outside third-party security company. Don't underestimate where you're going to want to take DCSM. You may think today all you want to do is floor planning and manage power, but in the long run, you may want to start doing things, tying into ITSM, tying into CMDB, maybe tying into your financial systems, SAP or PeopleSoft. You don't know where you may take it. So think big, start small, but think big and have that roadmap. And then think, how are you going to integrate, right? How are you going to integrate the data that's in your data center service management into other systems? And what systems might you want to integrate with? And I think that comes up in another slide. But does the vendor have a communication framework? Do they have connectors to the systems you have, right? And then lastly, we all know what it's like to be audited by the auditors, right? You want to have an audit trail. Make sure the architecture supports being audited, that has an audit trail, that has the reports to show what's happening in the data center so that the auditors don't look at you like you're crazy for not having this information and that you're tracking everything that's transpiring inside the data center. So again, architecture is a big deal. It's going to actually determine how easy it is for you to put in, how easy it is to maintain, and how costly the solution is going to be in the long run. Step 3, again, start small, but plan to grow, right? So start with DSIM, start with managing your infrastructure. And it's an easy way to get quick wins. You get the floor planner going, and then you can begin to branch into other forms of infrastructure, cabling, monitoring power, dealing with racks and blades and all of that. And then grow into managing the workflow, grow into managing the processes and the policies and measuring all that, and then begin to tie into other systems. Some folks just do data center infrastructure management with Nline, and then they integrate into CMDB or they integrate into change management. But we find a lot of companies do the natural, they manage the infrastructure, and then they grow into the workflow, and then they grow into integration, right? So start with DSIM, create that roadmap that gives you the quick wins, right? That's going to be the low-hanging fruit that you can begin to show folks what's transpiring and getting these, the efficiencies. And dev and test is a good place to start because it tends to be an organization that's pulling resources, but needs the tool to help basically manage where these resources are going. So dev and test tends to be a very good place to start. And then, as I mentioned before, one of the things that's very specific that you always find in high tech is something has been created. There has been a tool which somebody has put together. I was going to say hacked together, but that sounds bad. That they basically pulled together to try and do what a data center service management solution does, right? They've either done it with spreadsheets or they've done it with open source or they've hacked something together with Java or Ruby. Bottom line, you should find from the vendor what tools they have to migrate the information out of whatever you're using today into the system, right? And make sure they have the service and the experience doing that. And again, talk to them about real world cases where they've actually done that. So again, you start with DSIM, you grow really into DCSM and think big, right? Start small, but think big. Fourth step is sort of integration, and I say integrate with people and systems. I don't mean integrate with people like they're the Borg or something. What I'm saying is that you need to consider the systems you're integrating with and the people that you're communicating with. So to maximize the value of your solution, you're going to want to integrate downstream with BMS systems, with power systems, facility systems, and environmentals. But on the upstream, you're going to want to tie into ITSM, virtualization solutions, financial systems, a variety of systems so that anyone who's dependent on the data center having the most current information in their systems can tie into your data center service management solution. You're going to want to look for communication framework and pre-built connectors in your solution. So again, we talked about that before. If you have built your own custom apps, you want to make sure the vendor supports web services, supports RESTful APIs, and so forth. So again, if you have built your own apps, which most likely you have if you're in high tech, you're going to want to see what support there is to tie into those custom-built apps. And then you want to communicate the plan with other people in the organization that you're going to make their jobs easier. If they have the most current information, they don't have to do manual reconciliation, that things are automatically synchronizing, they'll back the project. They'll be more engaged if you're going to help them do their jobs more easily, right? This is sort of project management 101, but you want to communicate to them. You want to communicate the stages and the milestones, and that ultimately you're going to make their jobs easier because they're going to always have the most current information in an automated way. So again, sort of holistically, you're integrating and communicating with systems, you're communicating with people, because DCSM is not an island unto itself. You're going to want it to tie into other types of systems. And lastly, this is sort of ITIL best practices. As you begin to use a data center service management solution, you're going to naturally begin to measure not only how much capacity you have, how much power is being utilized, and so forth, those sort of core infrastructure type questions. You're going to start getting an idea what resources are being used from a people perspective, which business units are asking for changes, which business units have the most resources from a people perspective, from a personnel perspective being used, right? So you want the solution you decide to go with to have robust reporting capabilities, and you want to be able to generate your own custom reports. Watch out for vendors that basically charge you for additional reports. That's fine if they have professional services. Nlyte does if you want us to create your reports. But Nlyte also allows you to create your own custom reports and generate them on a periodic basis for folks perhaps outside of the data center, right? But the key is to measure the business before and after the implementation, but on an ongoing basis. So you can begin to measure, you report on those metrics, and of course constantly improve. And that's sort of classic ITIL, foundation type thing to do. And then, as I mentioned before, deliver automated reports to people outside the data center, and you're constantly measure and synchronizing that information into ITSM. And potentially, you can begin to charge back the business units. You can take the data center from being a cost center and begin to sort of charge back the different groups who are using the data center and using the resources. And today, as we all know, with Amazon, with Rackspace, those services tell you exactly what they're going to cost. And as a result, people are beginning to come to the data center and say, hey, how much does your service cost? How much is it costing for us to provide our own data center? And so by doing this, measuring, reporting, and improving the processes, you can begin to measure that and give people an idea of how much it costs to run the data center, right? To deliver the service for their particular part of the business. And you could potentially, if your organization is inclined, charge back the different business groups based on the resources they're using, not just only physical assets and power and cooling being used, but additionally the time spent making changes, adding new servers and so forth, and decommissioning and refreshing resources. So we have two high-tech case studies here. So one is a mid-size software provider. When we met them, basically, Devon Test was the key issue for them. They were constantly adding new capacity and new platforms across 3 different geographies. And I was sort of alluding to this particular case study earlier in the presentation. The CFO was always asking, where are these assets being deployed? He felt like there were always new POs coming across his desk, and everything was virtualized, so nobody could really tell them where the physical assets were. And they had implemented spreadsheets and had custom-built solution to try and manage this. Candidly, it just wasn't working, and it just wasn't getting updated. And so when they came to us, they implemented Nlyte, and the net result was they improved the overall planning process and oversight, because now they can turn to the CFO and tell them exactly where different POs went, which groups are using those resources, and how they're being applied. So really, this was in many ways to appease the CFO in the case of this mid-sized software provider. The second case study is a large security software provider. We actually have quite a few software security companies. I should say security software companies. This particular one had 18 data centers worldwide and an extremely lean team. Actually, it was amazing how small a team they had. And the challenge for them, and I took this right out of their words, right? Purchasing is all hosed up, is what they said. So nothing was mapping to the SAP instance. As they said, the whole purchasing process was hosed up so that assets were coming in, but they weren't being reconciled with their SAP instance. And additionally, because they had staff in different geographies, personnel around the world were performing processes and recording information inconsistently. So how they implemented new racks, how they implemented changes was inconsistent across the different data centers, and how they were reporting it was inconsistent. So they rolled out Nlyte to all 18 data centers worldwide. They didn't do that initially. They started knocking them down one by one, but they really deployed Nlyte, and the benefits are they've got now operational consistency, because whenever there are new racks, they're actually new racks or servers are sent out to a data center. There's a punch list is created for the individual as to what they're specifically going to do, where they're going to put those assets, where they're going to tie it into power, where they're going to tie it into networking. So they've increased the operational consistency, and they're actually extending BMC change management processes into the data center. So all these changes begin in BMC and then get punched into Nlyte, where they're then executed and deployed by personnel in the field. So two very specific case studies. And in summary, as I sort of mentioned earlier, right, DSIM really is the foundation of data center service management. I'm sure many of you are familiar with DSIM. There's been a lot written about DSIM. Nlyte was the first modern DSIM solution, and that really started about a decade ago. The key now is to sort of move towards data center service management, to not just manage infrastructure, but to manage the entire service holistically. And high-tech companies have those unique challenges, right? The fast-paced environment, lean environments where they've written their own tools, where they've got quite a large test and dev environment, and lastly, they tend to be very distributed. So DCSM is really designed to bring it all together. And really, from our perspective, based on the experience we have, and as I mentioned, we have a 99% customer retention rate. We've never had shelfware. We've seen what makes companies successful, right? It's picking the right vendor, consider the architecture, start with DSIM, but really have a plan to grow into the larger data center service management. Plan to integrate with systems, but also make sure you're over communicating to people, and then kind of your best practices of ITIL, measure, report, and improve, and you can really begin to optimize the data center, the resources it uses, and the personnel who are within the data center. So the last slide, I want to thank you for joining us. We want to get to some of the questions, and I'm running out of time rather rapidly. I'm a bit of a chatty Cathy today. Please feel free to join us again. We have an upcoming Field View real-time monitoring and alarming webinar. We're going to actually start promoting that in the next day or so. It'll be in 2 weeks. So please come back and join us for that. We're going to do a deep dive into the world of power, but not that type of power, but the type of power you find in the data center. And then if you are a Gartner customer, there's a great video out there. We had a panel at the Gartner Data Center Conference in December where Atos, Cisco, TransUnion, Sutter Health, and Verizon spoke on this panel. There's a link to it. If you need us to send that to you, feel free to email us at info@nlight.com. Also on our website, you can find DSIM for Dummies. We're actually going to be introducing the DCSM for Dummies book in the next 30 to 45 days, so look for that on the Nlight website. And if you have any questions or have any comments or want to reach out to us, feel free to reach us at info@nlight.com. And now I'm going to see if there are any questions. Jason, any questions?
Yeah, well, thanks for going through those 5 steps to realize the full DCSM benefits for our audience. I appreciate that. We have a lot of questions coming from the audience. The first question for you, Mark, is so what's your pricing model?
Oh, okay. So Nlight is priced purely on a rack basis, right? So we feel the value you get is the larger the data center, the more value. And so we've got companies using us as small as 25 racks, 50 racks, 100 racks. And then we have organizations as large as 32,000, 35,000 racks. The solution is certified. Our hyperscale solution is certified up to 150,000 racks, which you aren't going to find too many companies in this world at that type of scale. But we do have a broad range. I'd say our sweet spot is 1,500, 2,000, somewhere in there, 5,000 racks. But as I said, we get customers as large as we have deployments as large as, I think, 35,000 racks across 45 data centers, and as small as 25 racks, which they had. That was a medical company that needed to make sure they had HIPAA compliance and felt like they wanted to control those 25 racks very well.
Okay. All right. One more question, since we're running a little bit on time. So does Nlight provide ITSM?
Oh, okay. So I'm sorry if I misled anyone. We do not, Nlight does not provide ITSM. We integrate and provide pre-built connectors to companies like ServiceNow, HP, BMC, and we're typically, the most common touch points are we're tying into CMDB, we're tying into change management, we're tying into those types of solutions, because you can imagine a change management starts in ITSM, they get approval, they say here's what's being purchased, that gets punched into Nlight, where we then pick it up at the dock when it arrives, say where it's going to go, how it's going to get cabled up, where it's being placed, and then that information is fed back into change management. And obviously, where the assets are, how they're interconnected, what assets are dependent on one another gets fed back into CMDB. So I'm sorry if I misled anyone. We do not provide the ITSM solution. We typically tie into the industry-leading ones. And I think I'm being given we're running out of time. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks again, Mark, for your time, and thank you all for attending today's webinar. As I mentioned earlier today, before the call, the webinar will be made available to you within 72 hours by email. So if you have any additional questions, please send them to info@nlight.com, and we'll get back to you on that. So thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you next webinar. Thank you very much.